It's time once again for the Game of the Day presentation from the 2017 British Chess Championships. I'm Andrew Martin, and we're going to focus on the round 3 game between Richard Palliser, International Master, and Gawain Jones, Grandmaster. I've recorded in some eccentric locations over the years. Today I'm recording in a farmhouse in the Welsh Hills where I'm staying during the tournament. So if you hear a cockerel crowing in the background, that's what it's all about. Well, Palliser kicked off with e4, and Jones played a very fashionable variation of the Lopez, the Steinitz Deferred with d6. It's interesting, if you look around the world chess scene, you'll see that Caruana is playing this, Magnus Carlsen, on a regular basis. So they obviously feel this is a pretty good way to meet the Spanish torture. Well, of course, it's a very solid system. It looks a little bit passive at first sight and allows White to build a centre after c3. I mean, I think there are alternatives to c3. For instance, bishop takes c6 is definitely a move. Castles is definitely a move. But c3 intending d4 is the Lopez way. And now Black plays bishop to d7. White castles, and here we are, this move g6. Reaching a kind of modern defence or King's Indian position with the black pieces. And this was pretty popular back in the 1950s. It seems to be experiencing some sort of renaissance some 60 years later. Well, of course, if White can't find a way to open the position early, then Black is going to get a pretty good game. Just bishop g7, the knight on g8 comes to f6 or e7, he can castle and play for f5 later. So White has got to find a way to put the pressure on, and d4 must surely be the way. And Black plays bishop g7. I seem to remember that several sources were recommending the move d5 for White in this position. And just try to reach a King's Indian structure where you get to exchange the light squared bishops, which theoretically should favour White. As you can see, he's erected a pawn chain on light squares in the centre. So getting rid of this lousy bishop is a good idea. It's just that in this particular position, Black is quite well placed to force through the move f5. He's got to play h6 first, because White would play perhaps knight g5 to e6. But after knight c3 f5, yeah, I don't see why Black hasn't got reasonable chances here. Anyway, that's how they play it. Obviously, after bishop g7, White's got quite a few moves. He can play rook e1, he can play bishop to e3. I remember having quite an uncomfortable experience against this move, against the American Grandmaster Nick Defermian, where I played knight ge7, he took on e5, and then played bishop c5. And my knights were getting into a tangle. Of course, Black is absolutely not forced to enter this variation. For instance, after bishop e3, if we just drop back, he could play both b5 and knight f6. So there are definite alternatives to the knight move. All in all, thanks to recent investigations by Carlsen and Caruana et al., it seems as though Black is enjoying success with this variation. So bishop g5 was played by Palliser. And the idea of that is to encourage Black to play f6. Now, although that looks a little bit weakening, actually it's not a bad move for Black, because what it means is he can put his knight on g8 to h6 and then back to f7. On f7, the knight is pretty well placed, guards the centre, covers the g5 square in particular, and assists Black to play the move f5. So I don't think Black is too unhappy to see this move bishop g5. Palliser's idea is to try to saddle Black with weak pawns in the centre, and he tries to do this by taking on e5 and then plunging in with his queen, which is a pretty intimidating move. There was a game, Anand versus Carlsen, played in Stavanger in 2015, where actually White deviated from this by playing h3. Carlsen played his knight back to f7, and now White played c4, again playing for a superior structure. Black went on to win this game, but at the time being, I guess this is a little bit better for White. However, Palliser didn't do that. He played queen to d5, and Carlsen played queen to e7. And that's just preparing to cast on the queen side, I think, saying that, well, the white queen's a bit exposed. Now comes the first new move of the game, knight to a3. As we'll see, subsequently, actually, Palliser struggles to get this knight into the game. Well, it's just a move developing the pieces. White has to have a very good idea of where this knight's going when he plays such a move. Previously, the straightforward bishop c5 has been played. I think I slightly prefer that to knight a3. Probably forces black to put his queen on f7. And now white can continue with forcing play by playing bishop b3. I imagine this is pretty equal. It was obviously a conscious choice by Palliser to play something else. So he goes with knight to a3. And black castles on the queen side. Now, we were slightly worried in the commentary room that in a variation like this, white could get his queen to a7. Somehow, in the end, get his queen to a7. We'll see this idea coming up. But it turns out that black need not be afraid of that move. Well, Palliser played queen to d2. That's probably an imprecision. There's no need to retreat the queen just yet. For instance, you could play bishop c5 first. And if black wants to keep the queens on, he may have to put the queen on e8, and now white can go queen to c4. This might be a slightly more aggressive way to play the position. And I guess after that, black plays a move like, sensible move like king to b8, and white centralises his rook. We have to compare this type of position with what happens in the game. To me, it looks preferable to white. What black shouldn't do in this line is to go crazy with b5 and win a piece. I mean, you can't do something like that. Black's king is far too exposed, and white would break in with something like knight takes b5. I mean, this is just looking absolutely horrible for black. He's a piece up, but he's never going to get to enjoy it. Instead, queen d2 is a little bit passive and does allow black to gain the initiative. I know it attacks the knight on h6, but at the same time, that knight's happy to hop into g4 and get the dark square bishop off the board, which is a pretty big victory for black, I would say. Well, white went queen to e2. Now, if he goes h3, we can get a sequence something like the one I just described, where black takes the bishop off, queen takes, f5, and now takes, queen a7. Well, this looks dangerous, but in fact, turns out black can just ignore it and play f takes e4. There are no real threats for white in this position. Instead, it's black who has the threats. And a move like b6 at some point, I mean, black needn't play that just yet. He's going to cover the king quite comfortably. The queen's not really doing much down there. So this is why Palliser moves out of the way to move his bishop, I guess. And Jones chops the bishop off straight away and now plays the thematic f5. Again, provoking white to play bishop c6 and queen a7, which, as we've seen and discussed, achieved nothing. And it's around here that black starts to take over the game. The bishop on g7 doesn't look that impressive at the moment, but a glorious future awaits in some sort of late middle game and end game. Really, it's up to white now to demonstrate, you know, what he has actually got in this position. I mean, he can play a move like rook a d1, that might be best. And I guess there, black can play just king to b8, as he does a bit later in the game, and claim he's got a slight edge due to the two bishops. But I think I even prefer this position to the game. I guess, going back, black could also consider f4. I mean, this is what they sometimes do in this line, trying to get a pawn avalanche against the white king. But there we've got ideas such as rook takes d7. I mean, I don't know how good this is. It's a speculative try. Queen takes d7, knight takes g5, just to break up the avalanche and just say, well, your bishop on g7 is unimpressive. I've got some compensation for the exchange, but maybe this is good for black as well. So rook a d1 might have been a move, taking on f5. I think it just encourages black bishops, to be honest, opening up the position. So we're still waiting to see what Palliser's planning. He brings his rook to the centre, and now king to b8. So in comes the rook to d5. That's the second time a white piece has occupied that square. And for the second time, I'm not quite sure what it's achieving. Going back, it's hard to see a constructive plan for white. I mean, the long-term chances tend to favour black in a position like this, simply because his bishop on g7 can gradually come into the game. Maybe white should just get his knight back from the edge with something like knight c2, allow e4, and then hope to get some sort of strong outpost for his knight in the centre. But it's quite hard. I mean, he can take on c6 and put his knight on d4, but then bishop d7 is just solid. And if white goes f3 trying to break up the pawns, we just go rook he8 and takes. Very hard for white to fight against the bishop here in this position. And on top of everything else, black's got this passed pawn. You know, white could probably play a move like knight e2, intending to put the other knight on d4, but then comes bishop b5. And again, black is on top. So it's a strange situation. White doesn't seem to have played any bad moves at all. He plays very sensibly, but at the same time he's falling into a worse position. And perhaps it's the potential of the black variation that's attracting players like Caruana and Carlsen towards this line. So rook to d5, and now a very good move by Jones, e4. Once Gawain is given the chance to assume the initiative, he doesn't look back. And it sets a little trap in that if white plays rook fd1 here, black has got the splendid move f4, decoying the queen away from the e-file. I mean, white's got to go queen e2 or queen e1, which are obviously lousy, and black is getting ready to follow up this queen retreat with rook he8 as marked, and then he'd have beautifully centralised position, two mighty bishops, and strong pawns in the middle. So this is why Richard takes the knight off on c6, and then takes on f5. But this is risky because white is losing coordination. He's losing his pieces joining up in harmony when he takes that pawn. What else could he do? Well, dropping back, obviously he can take on d8 and put his knight on d4. I think there, black might well be happy just to take on d4 and play bishop d5, which is a surprisingly awkward move to meet. I think at the very least black's going to win a pawn, and here we see the plight of that knight on a3, which isn't really doing anything. For instance, if white tries to get some play with queen f4, which might be his best, I think black can settle for taking the pawn on a2 and then taking on d4, and he should be a pawn up. I mean, this is not that easy to win, obviously, but you've got 3-1 on the queen side and a bishop against a knight. So the chances all lie with black. Rook f5 in the game. In comes the rook to d3. Another good move. Running through this, the computers, they say actually that queen e6 is a better move. But you have to say that this rook d3 move looks very tempting indeed. And probably as Palliser was using up a lot of time on his clock, Jones simply wanted to get the initiative, and that's exactly what he does after queen g5, queen to d7. The white pieces are getting into a real tangle. Well, white played knight to d4, just hoping to force back to surrender the bishop, which, of course, he cheerfully does. If he goes backwards, I mean, I suppose you only do that sort of move as a last resort because it's very passive. Black has a nice choice between rook d1, which looks good, or rook to d6. And if knight c4, let's see this, rook to g6. This also looks pretty nice for black, with bishop b5 coming up. So I guess he couldn't bring himself to play such a passive move. The knight comes into the centre, but now Jones just takes the pawn and asks white, well, what have you got? Palliser played rook to c5, and now another splendid move, e3. Again, not the first choice of the machines. They recommend rook f8 in this position, with a clear advantage to black. But again, e3, very tempting. A lovely clearance sacrifice to make way for an attack on g2. Well, Richard takes the pawn, rook g8, and now this horrible move, g3. Well, as you can see, the problems for white are multiplying, and the light squares around the king are just looking terribly weak. So rook to d1 was the next move, piling in. I'm not sure what advice to offer really now. If white tries to cover his back with queen e2, we go rook d2, and clearly black is well on top. But after f3, rook e8, all the black pieces are now piling into the attack, and it's very hard to offer white any advice at all. I don't think there's anything he can do. So we get a forced sequence where Palliser blocks with rook e5, and now Jones just finishes him off. Rook takes f1 check, in comes the queen, and the simple rook takes e5 will do, as after queen takes e5, queen takes f3 check, it's actually forced mate. Bishop d7, king h4, and now queen to g4. Completing a very well played game by Gawain Jones. That's just about the best game I've seen so far on the top boards in the first 3 rounds. And it does give us an indication of, you know, a system against the Spanish. This move, bishop d7, the Steinitz Deferred, coming very much back into fashion. And white has it all to do to find an adequate antidote. Obviously, there's several ways for him to get an equal game. But if he wants more than that, well, black is holding his own at the moment.